Great. So thank you so much to the organizing committee for this opportunity to speak today. The last couple of years have been really challenging for all of us all around the world, and it's sort of pushed us to try things differently, to deliver education differently, and with those come challenges in being able to optimize the way that we offer our education, particularly through simulation. So today I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about virtual debriefing and how to best optimize the learning experience through platforms such as this when we're debriefing through online platforms. So the objectives for today are to describe a conceptual framework for virtual debriefing. I'll then go into illustrating some techniques to enhance the virtual debriefings that you're running. And then lastly, I'm going to highlight some faculty development strategies for virtual debriefing. So just last week, actually, there was a paper published by a colleague of mine, Amanda Rose Desordan, and in her paper, what she describes is 4 key roles for the simulation educator or debriefer. So when facilitating or conducting a debriefer, we see the debriefer playing the role as a guide who both develops and nurtures relationships and provides some structure to the conversation. The debriefer also facilitates conversation, and in doing that role, he or she seeks to understand learner perspectives, responds to learner thoughts and emotions. Of course, there's a teacher role as a debriefer, so there you're imparting knowledge, you're cultivating insights. And then lastly, sometimes there's a need to be a mediator when there's conflict, when there's disagreement. The debriefer then manages this conflict, seeks to flatten hierarchies, and reconcile differences. All of these 4 roles and the role of the debriefer is underpinned by the importance of psychological safety. And so without a psychologically safe learning environment, specifically within this debriefing conversation, it makes it really difficult for the debriefer to execute these 4 roles. And so the question is how do these 4 roles translate over to the virtual or online environment? And what is different? And how do we make it feel like we're in person? So let's start first with the definition of virtual debriefing. Virtual debriefing is a type of virtual learning where educators use web-based video conferencing to facilitate reflective discussions. As I said, in the past couple of years, there's been a very abrupt shift to telesimulation with virtual debriefings. And, this has forced simulation educators to adapt their current debriefing approaches to online platforms. Unfortunately, many debriefing skills that they normally use don't necessarily translate over to the online environment. And so what educators need is some sort of practical guidance to support meaningful virtual learning and the transition from in-person to virtual debriefings. And I believe this is best framed by the 3 presences that are described in the Communities of Inquiry framework. So Professor Randy Garrison and his team have offered up this Communities of Inquiry framework to describe 3 core interrelated elements: teacher presence or educator presence, social presence, and cognitive presence, all of which are required to create successful virtual learning environments. And these 3 elements, what they do is they help to conceptualize how online learning spaces are jointly created by the manner in which educators plan and facilitate their session, how learners think and solve problems together, and the ways in which all parties sort of connect socially within these online contexts. And although this was originally developed for asynchronous online learning, this Communities of Inquiry framework has been studied and applied extensively and adapted to synchronous online learning, and I believe that it is a very nice fit for what we do as debriefers in the virtual environment. And so today I'm going to be talking about some of the details shared in this paper that was recently published in Advances in Simulation. So to be socially present, individuals, they should be able to project their personal characteristics and their identity in the online environment. And so, for example, a normally extroverted and gregarious person, sometimes they may actually project as shy, cautious, or introverted in an online environment. So what we want to do is we want to create an environment where they can project their real selves. And this involves creating a climate where learners can communicate openly and share an emotion that's been generated by their learning experiences. And so three key elements of social presence are open communication, emotional expression, and group cohesion. So psychological safety is required to be able to build social presence. So psychological safety is really the sense and the perception that consequences of taking interpersonal risks in a given context. For example, in a particular team, it's sort of a sense of confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, punish someone for speaking up. What's key about psychological safety is that it's not something that can be declared. It's something in the eyes and minds of the learner. And so it's perceived, it's unstable, it's dynamic, and it's extremely fragile. And you have to work as an educator to be able to build and maintain psychological safety. So if we think about the typical simulation that contains, a pre-briefing, a simulation event, and a debriefing. So we've all been taught during the pre-briefing to address psychological safety and to reassure learners that it's a safe environment. However, just because we declare that doesn't necessarily make it so. And so our job is to start to build psychological safety in the pre-briefing, through the simulation, and then maintain it in the debriefing. And this requires us to be consistent. And so what we say in the pre-briefing needs to be carried through to the debriefing. If we make promises in the pre-briefing, we need to execute those promises in the debriefing. When those promises are broken, they represent a threat to psychological safety. And then what happens is then you have to work to rebuild psychological safety as an educator, and that becomes much tougher. So I want to show you a quick video, and this video is of a debriefing. Now the simulation was an online simulation where there were 3 participants. I'm playing the role of the emergency doctor. The gentleman in the right lower panel is a fellow. The young lady in the right upper panel is a nurse. And then Grace Amy, who's a colleague and friend of mine from New York, she's playing the role of the debriefer in the left upper panel. And so she's run us through a simulation where we had to conduct a huddle in the trauma room in advance of a sick patient arriving for us to look after. And so what I want you to look at is sort of what elements of debriefing make it challenging, what features or what behaviors threaten the psychological safety of this debriefing.
So now let's talk about maintaining situational awareness when you are assessing the workflow and volume in the ED. So looks like you were getting a team together pretty well in the process, but somewhere along the line, right before the patient arrived, you learned that the ED was actually pretty full and there were multiple patients in the waiting room. So I'm curious to hear, how did that change your assessment of how you should organize yourself? Katie, there?
Go ahead, Aaron.
I don't know how I did, because a lot of this new functions, I was wondering what we were going to do it all. The patients are on the minute, and the room's just getting clean. We can't stick the patients there. We do, give them COVID while we're trying to stop them from seizing. And so I was starting to worry we were going to intubate the nurses with you.
Good point.
If you get intubated, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I was just wanting to get a space. It didn't really matter how big or what I did on normal days, and I was more just worried about human resources and this patient.
Yeah, that's certainly a concern typically in a busy emergency department.
So you can see from this short clip that there are already several things that are apparent, the potential challenges with debriefing in the online environment. First off, there's one learner who's sort of coming on and off camera, which makes it really difficult to interact with that particular person. The camera view of the two of the participants is skewed, and one is off to the side and the other half of his head is cut off. And then you can notice that they have trouble with turn taking, and so that makes the flow of conversation quite challenging. And then, of course, at the very end, Aaron, who's playing the role of fellow, is typing on his computer, which can be quite distracting. Not exactly knowing what he's doing, but ultimately we learned that he's actually typing in a chat box for which there was no particular ground rule set ahead of time in terms of how the chat box was going to be used. And so all of these different behaviors contribute individually and then collectively to threaten psychological safety. And so these are some additional barriers are also the reduced use and ability to use nonverbals as signals for cueing and for facilitating conversation, the difficulty with eye contact and being able to manage conversation by using eye contact, and lastly, the difficulty to be able to acknowledge contributions through nonverbals. And so all of these present significant challenges in trying to facilitate debriefing in the online environment. The question is, if these are the challenges, then what do we do to go about building and maintaining psychological safety in this new environment? So the first comes with very explicit verbal communication. So what we say, like that carries through in virtual debriefings, and that's really important. And so all of these different strategies that I listed there, the expression of appreciation, validating and acknowledging contributions, normalizing certain behaviors, particularly errors when they occur, is incredibly powerful. As a debriefer, if you're able to demonstrate some vulnerability, that will help to flatten hierarchy and also level the playing field to make learners feel psychologically safe. And then inviting and encouraging input verbally and the use of inclusive language. Words like we and us, as opposed to you did this, and you did this, you did that, next time you need to do this and that. The use of terms like we and us can help to build psychological safety and a sense of teamwork. Nonverbal or implicit strategies, they're generally categorized as sort of state of mind, body language, and eye contact. And of course, as I mentioned, these things here, the body language and the eye contact, are a lot more difficult to use in online debriefings. So we need to rely more on verbals, and when possible, if you can exaggerate your body language, that can help. And so oftentimes what I like to do is I like to make my torso visible, and the reason is that allows me to demonstrate interest by leaning in a little bit, right? If I'm purely out to the camera like this, my learners don't know if I'm leaning in or not because my face is pressed up against the camera the entire time. And so just being back again allows me to see my torso, but it also allows me to use my hands, demonstrate interest, and then when I'm generating sort of facial expressions, I'll just try to be a little bit more demonstrative in comparison to if I was doing this in an in-person environment. So if I'll smile, I'll smile bigger. If I nod, I'll nod a little bit more deliberately. And these little things help to demonstrate sort of validation, communicate validation. And all of this is described in a paper published by Mechanical in EMJ Simulation Technology Management. So if we come back to the three presences, so cognitive presence will remind you, so how learners think represents their cognitive presence, and it's defined as the extent to which learners critically reflect and construct meaning through reflective discourse. And so indicators of cognitive presence include learners who are able to identify problems, exchange and connect ideas, brainstorm solutions, and find new concepts to their existing practice. So virtual debriefings, they also benefit from educators who are able to adeptly manage the debriefing process to prompt reflection while both balancing learner and instructor centeredness. And so in particular, learner-centered facilitation approaches, they enhance cognitive presence through reflective discourse that encourages learners to identify and explore problems, exchange knowledge and debate activities, for example, and to apply new concepts and solutions. And so one of the best ways to enhance cognitive presence is to apply a more learner-centered approach to debriefing. There are a few technical things that you can do to enhance cognitive presence. So firstly, we encourage the use of breakout rooms. If you're in a larger group, you can always have the option to have sort of smaller breakout rooms with smaller debriefings, which gives people more of an opportunity to share. Please establish rules for using the chat box. Yes, the chat box is a great tool. However, it can be distracting if there's too much chatter that's going on in parallel with the chat box in conjunction with the live conversation. Please set some guidelines for muting and unmuting. Typically when we're running courses, if we have a smaller group, 4 to 6 people, we'll just have everyone unmuted, and that actually helps to promote conversation. There's sort of less of this turn-taking issue, but of course for that to work, everyone's background needs to be very quiet. Then of course we really like to have everyone on camera, on view, so that you can see people, you can see their facial expressions, you can see their body language. There's nothing more challenging than facilitating a small group conversation where only a fraction of the people are on video. So we really like to encourage everyone to be on video and to use the group view. And so establishing rules of engagement are really important for promoting and encouraging and optimizing cognitive presence. And so this whole notion of turn-taking, hand-raising, like how are you going to hand-raise? Are you going to actually allow people to raise their hands like this, or do they have to put the yellow hand emoji up? What are you going to do to minimize interruptions? And how can we ensure that people aren't multitasking on their phones the entire time during these sessions? And so setting some ground rules ahead of time help to clarify that. So moving on to educator presence. And so educator presence, it relates to how educators design and implement educational activities, how they facilitate discourse, how they provide instruction. And so the task of the educator is to appropriately structure and deliver content, define topics, guide discussion, seek consensus, and to summarize key learning points, as you all know. And so while sort of in-person and virtual debriefings may differ in some aspects, the basic tenets of effective debriefing still apply, and using a structured framework is one of these basic tenets. And so we encourage you to sort of use a framework that you're familiar with. Whatever it is, there's a variety of different frameworks out there, but what that will help you do is to provide a consistent structure to the discussion that your learners are familiar with. So as I mentioned, many different debriefing frameworks out there, whether it's debriefing, good judgment, or gas model, 3D model, diamond debriefing, and there are more multi-phase frameworks like the PROS framework, team games, after action military review. Just pick one that you're most comfortable with, pick one that you're most familiar with, and that your learners are most familiar with. And of course, ideally it's a framework that can be applied whether you have one facilitator or whether or not you're co-debriefing as a pair. So there are various different conversational techniques out there in the debriefing toolbox, such as learner self-assessment, plus delta, feedbacks, with questions, efficacy inquiry, etc., etc. These techniques, what the aim is to engage participants in different manner, with different goals. And so what we want to try to do, as with in-person debriefing, is to pick and choose the conversational strategy and tailor it to your need, your learning goal, learning context, and your learning objectives. Debriefing scripts help novice debriefers achieve that goal, and so we often encourage the use of scripts to help to accelerate the learning curve a bit. They provide sort of structured learning for people to get through a debriefing if they're not as experienced. This is one example of a debriefing script that's on our website, debrieftolearn.org. This debriefing script, I think, is now available in 8 or 9 different languages. I believe it is available in American as well, so you can go to the website, download this script for free. You can see on both sides that on one side provides the structure and on the back some details with respect to debriefing approaches. And so I sort of encourage you to think about using these cognitive aids to support faculty development, because I think you'll find that it helps to get your debriefers up to speed much quicker compared to their non-teachers. And just one final word about virtual debriefing. What we found is it's really important to use checklists to ensure we're covering off all the key things before we dive into a virtual session. And so this is an example of a virtual debriefing checklist for learners. We also use one for our faculty to get our faculty on board in advance of sessions. And so with our learners, we'll just go through this checklist with them ahead of time to help to establish ground rules and set expectations. So in the final 5 or 10 minutes today, what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about what we can do to help our debriefers get better at virtual debriefing. How do we train our simulation educators? And so reflecting on this grid, which was presented by Yvonne Steiner and her team in a recent review of faculty development approaches for medical education, she offers sort of 4 different key categories for faculty development approaches. And today I'm going to be talking about sort of 2 key categories, this category of peer coaching with learner or expert feedback, and then also this notion of sort of learning by doing, by observing, and self-assessment. So if you think about the simulation educator, who's there sort of noted in the circle up there at top, there's sort of 4 key sources of feedback for this person. He or she can receive feedback from their learners, from their peers. They can self-reflect, or they can receive feedback from experts. And so first off, how do we go about optimizing peer feedback to enhance our own debriefing skills? So what we found is that it's really difficult often to encourage folks to give feedback to each other within simulation programs. There's obviously challenges with respect to hierarchy. There's challenges with respect to learning needs, right? Some simulation educators are working on one thing while others are working on something else. And then of course there's challenges because some folks just don't have the expertise to be able to deliver effective feedback with respect to debriefing. And so one of the key activities that we like to encourage is this setting the stage conversation. Namely, we encourage educators to get together ahead of time before they deliver the simulation session to chat about how their peer coaching is going to work on that day, what their learning needs are, what they're working on that day, and how they can help each other get better. We find that just by having this conversation, it not only improves the peer coaching conversations that happen later, but also it enhances the likelihood that they'll actually occur. And to support these peer coaching activities, we have a peer coaching checklist, which essentially has all these elements of excellent debriefings with very, very discrete, detailed information to support meaningful feedback. And so when people don't know, what behaviors they're looking for, this checklist helps orient them to the behaviors that they're looking for. Secondly, self-reflection can potentially be, a great opportunity to get better. Let's remind ourselves of the importance of informed self-assessment. And so the more we do self-assessment, the more it helps to promote goal setting and encourages us to commit to getting better. Of course, objective feedback is really important. If we're just basing our self-assessments on our own judgments, that's less effective compared to if we actually have objective external data supporting our own self-assessments. And the more accurate the assessment, more likely that it's going to lead to behavioral change. So what we're looking for is both our internal data, which is our own subjective perception of our performance, coupled with external objective data to support our assessments. And so the way to do that, I think, is you can either have like a peer coaching checklist, as I mentioned before. You can use a Dash tool or an OSAD tool. These are two different sort of debriefing assessment tools where you can sort of self-reflect on your own performance using very objective, well-defined criteria with a rating scale. And so you can sort of look, see how you did on one element versus another from debriefing to debriefing to help yourself understand where you're struggling and how you can get better. And so if you're going to self-assess, use some sort of checklist or debriefing tool to support your self-assessments. And then lastly, there is obviously opportunity to receive feedback from experts. Now, this can be challenging because power differentials and hierarchies within our healthcare system exist, and these are very real, and these must be managed to optimize the feedback experience. And so the way that we've done this within our program is we've set up group feedback sessions that are virtual online in the Zoom environment, where all of our fellows will bring sample videos of their own debriefing performances that are tagged at specific points that they'd like to discuss. And then the facilitators of that feedback conversation, which would include folks like myself, my colleague Vince Grant, and others, we may bring videos of our own debriefings as well. And so what we do is we go around, everyone shares their own videos, we all sort of collectively reflect and give each other feedback. And what we hope is that by Vince and I sharing our own debriefings as well, we're demonstrating some vulnerability there. We're trying to model that, just because we're the directors of the program, we're still open to feedback. And in doing so, we hope to sort of flatten the hierarchy a bit to make it a little bit easier for them to give us feedback, but also for us to give them feedback on their debriefing skills. And so everyone shares. We try to create an environment where it's a level playing field. And in doing so, we found that these sessions are very powerful at helping folks improve their debriefing skills. And so to summarize, I think, we talked about 3 different key presences: social presence amplified by the importance of psychological safety, cognitive presence enabled by optimizing technology, and teacher presence sort of supported by debriefing tools. These 3 key presences helping us deliver optimal virtual debriefings. And then with respect to faculty development, utilizing peer coaching by having a setting the stage conversation, using informed self-assessment to support your own assessments of your own debriefings, and finally, incorporating some expert feedback by helping to flatten the hierarchy. These 3 faculty development strategies to help your faculty get better at virtual debriefings. Hopefully you found a few pearls to support your practice in that talk. Thank you again for the opportunity. Hope to meet you guys soon in real life.